Hello and welcome to After Pavo for November. It's taken me honestly a while to make this video. It's gonna be a bit late. I think the issue is that the books this month I don't hate, but I also am just not that excited to talk about. But here we go. So I've got 4 physical ones and 3 ones that I read via PDFs or ebooks or whichever. They're fine, like, we'll see as we get there. The Siege of Krishnapur is the Booker Prize winner of whichever year it has on screen. One of the very many Booker Prize winners from early in the prize's history that are very fixated on the end of British colonial India. So it is by an English author writing about a historical moment in the 1800s where I actually don't know if it's fictional or if it's real, but it's a compound where they're besieged, as the novel would say. And so we have English characters at the very beginning living out a very stereotypical English life. They're having picnics, they're playing games, they're doing little performances, like how you would expect the stereotypical English people to behave when they're quite affluent and relaxed. And yet there's this pervasive feeling that they don't deserve to be doing this lifestyle in a place like India. Something as simple as climate or culture or language, like the author does try to approach the complexity of Indian culture, even as it is quite, I guess, limited. Like, it's written in the 1970s. I can tell that it's quite well researched, but I also don't know how properly authentic it is. And I guess if I knew more about J.G. Farrell as an author, I would be able to speak more on it as well. But just for now, I think he's done an okay job. I think the characters feel quite realistic, and there is a reluctance to give a lot of psychological depth to the Indian characters, because I feel like what this novel is really trying to get at is an indictment of the white characters. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I see what it's trying to do. In many ways, it almost kind of functions as a slasher film. Like, it's characters being punished for vices, and that vice in particular is colonialism. So I think for a novel that's trying to unpack the aftermath of British colonialism in India, it does work. I think it's just not necessarily what I would recommend to read today in 2025, but for its time, like, I get that people in England were really interested in this theme, and I think it's written not as irresponsibly as one might expect. It's very much damning with faint praise, and I think that's probably the recurring theme of books this month, is that they are fine for their time, and it feels a bit cruel to complain about them too much, but they're also not super exciting, and I also wouldn't pull this from a shelf and really recommend this to anybody. I think that the vignettes are fine, it's interesting. I do think the representations of military strategy here are really quite fascinating, just the way that the characters try to solve their problems and try to rely on what they themselves identify as British characteristics and British values, and how just ineffective that is sometimes, is interesting to me. And I think I will eventually get to a point where I can unpack the British literary heritage. I'll do a video on Shakespeare, I'll do a video more about the canon, and then leave it all behind. Like, it's not the most interesting thing to me, but it is also, I think, quite necessary in the world that we live in now, and in the literary world, speaking about this, and just something as centralizing as the Booker Prize arising from the British Commonwealth and beginning from books that unpack this nature of British Empire. I think it's definitely worth examining and talking about. So I would give this a 3 out of 5. I would not really recommend reading it unless you're doing a challenge to read all the Booker Prize winners, but I do think it is a very interesting historical footnote, and it's not something that I regret reading, although, yeah, it's fine. Book number 2, we go to our something spooky for the month. This one was a very quick read. The Curious Incident, The Mysterious Case, oh, I forgot what the name of this novel is. The Whatever Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a novella by Robert Louis Stevenson. It is about 30,000 words long, so a very quick read. I did it in about an afternoon. I enjoy Victorian mysteries. I think that the Victorian era really codified this idea of mystery, and it resonated well with this world of people that was experiencing scientific discovery and was starting to understand their place in the world, but was not fully secure of that. And so there are these really interesting questions in a novel like this about, well, what is morality? What is psychology? How can you affect your being through chemistry? And can you make a potion that would separate your good and your bad attributes? So this novel doesn't really function like a sci-fi novel, something like a Frankenstein. It doesn't unpack the ramifications of that. Instead, it's really just a mysterious story about what could happen, what is possible, and pushing against our conceptions of reality to present us something that's plausible. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, culturally being so salient in the literary world, kind of makes it an underwhelming read, because it's very much a book that teases you with the possibility of this being true. And there's so much like, there's no way, how could he be at two places at once? Like, how does that make any sense? Whereas I think we know how the story works, is that he drinks a potion and he changes. So, well, it's a foregone conclusion, and it means that the actual reading experience of the novel is just not as exciting as it would have been to its original audience, and yet I can still appreciate it. I think there's interesting things about it. It does have interesting things to say about morality in the lens that, is it chemical? Is it predetermined? Is it something that we can control using science? And I guess that's a question that we still haven't properly answered. So that's not actually what we're talking about. I think if you want to read this as a fun mystery story, it does have its chops. I think that the characterization's done really well. The way that each beat is revealed is quite well done. I like that the themes of science and of experimentation kind of unfold organically, and it resonates well with what's happening in the story in terms of its action and its plot. And because it's so short, I'm very forgiving of it. I think it didn't waste my time, which is why I don't dislike it as much as some other Victorian mysteries, thinking about like the Wilkie Collins kind of big long novels. I don't like those quite as much. But here, I mean, I don't regret reading it. It is still, to me, a 3 out of 5. I think it's got some interesting points. It's got some interesting structures. Time has really not been kind to it, in that the conclusion is just spoiled for everyone. But I mean, it's fine. It's good. It also builds tension really well for something with Victorian sentence structure. It is a late Victorian text, but it does care about everyday vernacular. It does have characters that are experiencing things in real time, and so it doesn't feel as laborious to read as some of the earlier Victorian mysteries. Next one, because I want to, The Ghost Cities by Siang is the Miles Franklin winner of 2025, I believe, and it is a very unexpected Miles Franklin winner by an Asian Australian author, and it's also one of the rare humorous Miles Franklin winners. I feel like the Miles Franklin Award tends to go to very serious, very personal writing. Historical fiction happens pretty often, and so to have a book that did genuinely make me laugh is surprising to me. So Ghost Cities, premise-wise, is a mishmash of a lot of things. It riffs a little bit on Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. It looks at ancient Chinese kingdoms and empires and how they treated various elements of their court, their scholars and the historians and their servants and the tacticians. It has this underlying plot where emperors are trying to maintain their power and control language, control history and culture. While that's going on, we have this modern day story where a translator who is fired from his job as consulate because he's been using Google Translate the entire time. He becomes a viral sensation in China, #bad Chinese, and he's brought over by this eccentric director to a manufactured city called Portmanteau, where he is then kind of like this reality TV actor to try and make this film about Chinese culture in the city that doesn't truly exist. So we have these questions about performance and identity, the diasporic Chinese culture versus the real Chinese culture, and it's just kind of jokey and funny. It's got lots of these little mysterious things, and it has this veneer of, does anything really mean anything in this book? Is everything actually trying to say something, or is it just a bunch of absurdity that's just there to make the audience laugh? And I think the director, his name's Belly Bao, something like that, Baby Bao, the director, he has that eccentric vision. He has that way of making the audience doubt what reality is. And as long as he's there, and as long as he's this driving force behind the story, and we have our main character who's just kind of being brushed along, then it's fine. I do wish that the references to Chinese culture were a bit more concrete and a bit more... I don't necessarily want to say authentic, because I think I fit myself in a very similar space to the narrator of this story. Like, I am ethnically Chinese, but I did grow up in Australia. I don't know that much of Chinese culture to talk about myself in terms of authenticity. Certainly a lot less than someone who was born and raised and grew up in China, studied the classics, knows the history. So, to that extent, like, you could fool me. And in the same sense that you could fool me, and you could fool a primarily white Australian reader. You could fool a Miles Franklin judge. You could say something like, this is the truth of Chinese history, and who's gonna fact check that, right? And it's so hard to fact check that as well, because Chinese culture and the way that it's been written about through the centuries and centuries of dynastic structure, it's pretty hard to summarize. And so, as a novel like this, I don't necessarily think of it as one that presents Chinese culture in a particularly enlightening light. Like, I wouldn't recommend people read this to understand Chinese diaspora or Chinese culture or migration or anything like that. Like, I don't think information is the intention here. But it is a book that invites the audience along on this joke, and it pokes fun at the absurdities of being Chinese and being a migrant and having this language that is complicated and incorporates its own little quirks and foibles in the same way that English is, that we can make jokes in English and we can make jokes in Chinese, and to be a bilingual person as well and to follow along with the jokes that function in both languages is pretty pleasurable. But then I put the book down and I think, well, what do I gain from reading this? Like, is there any lasting thematic assertion that comes out of this book? And I think that it's a bit too defensive to say that there is. It's leaning more towards the comedy side in order to not make a definitive statement. I feel really cruel saying this, but I didn't walk away from this book thinking that it had a true perspective to make. Instead, it's just poking and prodding and expanding the space, but not in a direct way. What a vague thing to say. But then again, I appreciate it. I appreciate that a novel like this can still win the Miles Franklin, that it shows that something weird and unusual can succeed in the Australian literary landscape. So, good. 4 out of 5. I will say that there are things about this book that I think are a bit shallow, and I wish that I could say that it's good on every front, but it really isn't. I think that I'm someone that likes good characterization. I really enjoy just a deep, rich, and complex and multifaceted character, and I didn't really get that from this. I think it definitely is more of a novel of... I know I just criticized it for not having ideas, but it is a novel of ideas. It presents ideas, and it uses characters as tools for those ideas, rather than showing you people as they are. And so, that's something that I think does also hold back my enjoyment of this work. My something light, Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. So, the ABC 100 came out, and this novel scored very highly on it. It's recent, it's, again, a bit of a crowd-pleaser novel, and it falls into that category of historical fiction where a plausibly feminist figure exists in a patriarchal society. And so I've read a number of books that I would put in this category. I would say The Girl with the Pearl Earring, Year of Wonders, Dictionary of Lost Words, and Lessons in Chemistry, to me, fits that mold. We follow Elizabeth Zott, who is a chemist and yet because of sexism in the workplace, she's unable to pursue her career in chemistry, and so she ends up on television running a cooking show where she approaches it with a very scientific and a very free-minded attitude towards how she goes about things. It is a very feminist novel. I do think it's a novel that promotes agency in women, and as a baseline, I mean, of course, that's a good thing. I think it does want to make the reader feel really good. It is a positive work, and it does use moments of darkness to do that. I do think that there are, at times, quite gratuitous representations of sexism and sexual violence and outright hatred in this book that the protagonist manages to overcome, and it makes the reader feel like this is the ultimate arc of feminism, is that there is bad in the world and it can be overcome. I think in a simplistic lens this is true, and it does feel good to win those victories, but I also think that the larger systemic problems that this novel kind of glosses over are also hard to ignore. So it's a novel set in the 1960s, and what I really hoped that it would untangle a little bit more of was just how much social upheaval was happening in this period, not just in the lens of feminism, but also in the civil rights movement, in the Vietnam War, in American culture and McCarthyism, television, and the nuclear family. I think all of that is in this book, but at times kind of just given lip service. Like, I feel like there's an offhand mention of Rosa Parks, and there's brief discussions of the Vietnam War draft, but it doesn't feel richly entangled in this historical period as a more literary novel would. Like, I wouldn't necessarily call this a literary novel, I would call this contemporary historical fiction. What a weird thing to say. But it's made for enjoyment, and it is in my something like category, and I did enjoy it. I do think that it's possible to thread an evil with a novel like this, that it can have that more deeper social commentary whilst also having that feeling of triumph and victory in the individual sense. But I also think that would be a much harder novel to write and a much harder novel to sell. I think this novel functions as a pretty good commercial piece. Like, it's easy to recommend to people, it's easy to pick up, it's easy to market. It's so very clearly it. Like, the cover is just so emblematic. I joked about this to a friend, like, I feel very performative reading this, because you can't look at this book and think it's not lessons in chemistry. Like, it's just so obviously it. I thought the chemistry was interesting. Like, I did briefly Google some of the chemical whatever terms in it, and I don't know enough about chemistry to fact check it. Like, I think it's, if I was being very cynical, I would call it a very kind of Big Bang Theory attitude towards both chemistry and cooking and television. I think even for a novel so interested in television and mass media and culture, it did make me think, well, does a television set really work that way? Like, is it so live that someone can just go off script of the teleprompter and everything will work out? Like, I haven't watched a lot of 60s television, so I can't say for certain, but that feeling of verisimilitude didn't always land for me. And I found myself often forgiving this novel because I kept having to remind myself, like, I'm here to enjoy this. I'm here because it's supposed to be fun, it's supposed to be triumphant and joyful, and it is all of those things. And I can put it down and not think about it very much afterwards. And that, I think, to me, sits very squarely in the 3 out of 5 category, is that it's not easy to write an enjoyable novel. And especially difficult is one where you're covering so much historical time, you're dealing with themes that are a bit more difficult, that it is reckoning with historical injustices, and it doesn't, for what it's worth, it doesn't make light of it. It doesn't minimize it, and it does show how difficult it is for Elizabeth Zott to make her way through a world that doesn't seem to support her. It makes the triumphs feel more earned, and it works. It definitely works. That's, I guess, what I have to say about it. Okay, talking about our Shakespeare for this month, Cymbeline is a lesser known Shakespearean play, and it's understandable why that's the case. So it's set in ancient Britain with a relationship to ancient Rome, and one of those confusing plays where it's hard to decide if I want to call it a tragedy or a comedy, because it does have tragic elements, like characters do die, there are stakes, and at times it feels very Othello-like, because it is a romance story, and it is very deeply about infidelity. So the premise is that the king, Cymbeline, and his wife have sort of this arranged marriage situation with their daughter, Imogen. The queen wants to marry Imogen to Cloten, who is her son from a previous relationship, and in doing so would entrench the queen's power in the kingdom. Whereas Imogen is in love with Posthumus, who is a commoner. And so this love causes Posthumus to be banished from England. He finds his way to, I believe, Italy or Rome or Venice, something like that. And in his exile, he is tricked by one of his friends into thinking that Imogen isn't loyal, isn't going to wait for him when he comes back. So because of this, we have this tragic story where Posthumus kind of gives up on the dream. He joins the Roman army, he marches against England in like a my life doesn't matter anymore sort of story, and he ends up... Here's where things get comedic, is that it's really messy. It's not a straightforward tragedy where the shortcomings of one particular character result in their downfall. Instead, it's very much more akin to those comedic Acts 2s, 3s, and 4s where a bunch of characters put on disguises, get confused, trick each other, and something not entirely tragic comes out of it. So, and the interesting character to me in all of this is Cloten, because I find that Shakespearean villains tend to be quite Machiavellian. They have their plots and their plans, they do represent some kind of human vice, and Cloten just doesn't. Cloten's just an evil, strong dude. He's just like a lunkhead who wants to marry Imogen for power, and he has no clue how to navigate any kind of situation. He gets himself killed in extremely silly circumstances, and like, what does this mean, right? Like, what thematically is it trying to say if we view it as a tragedy in a modern lens? Like, if we read Shakespearean tragedies for an understanding of hubris and the human condition, this is not a great one for that. It has some of it. It does explore romantic love, it does explore loyalty and devotion to one another and how we can trust people, but there's other tragedies that do that a lot better. And you can't really run it as a comedy because it's just not as funny. So it sits kind of languishing in this middle ground where, and I find this so interesting too, in Shakespeare's context, this play was really popular. And it works well because if you don't know what the plot is, it can be quite tense. You don't know if it's going to result in a tragic ending or if it's going to have a proper, like, bright resolution. Contrasting to something like Macbeth, where from the very beginning you know that it's going to be a dark and tragic play. I think another example of a play like this is Othello, where at the very beginning it is funny. It is about hijinks, and you don't know that it's going to lead towards somewhere much darker. Cymbeline similarly leads audiences in this feeling of, oh, I don't know what's going to happen next, and it's thrilling. And yet now, with all this historical context, we do know what happens next, and so that element of the play is lost. The spectacle as well is lost. Like, it's got a lot of battles, it's got a lot of, like, traveling to different locales, and all of that, I think, is just not as impressive in the way that we look at Shakespeare today versus what Shakespeare's plays were in his original time. And so I get why this is one of his lesser remembered plays. It's pretty long, too. It's pretty complicated. Give it a 3 out of 5. Like, it's not one of his best ones, and I understand why. Second last one, for my yearly challenge, I'm going to talk about Mr. Norris Changes Trains by Christopher Isherwood. This is a 2-novel set, so the first novel is Mr. Norris Changes Trains, and then it's Goodbye to Berlin. Goodbye to Berlin is a much more complex and interesting novel, which I would probably read some other day. I thought I would read both, and then time got in the way. So Miss Norris Changes Trains is a sort of auto-fictive story about the narrator, who is a thinly veiled Christopher Isherwood, who's come to Berlin in order to pursue this hedonistic lifestyle in the 1930s. Christopher Isherwood is a queer author, and he is leaving the more puritanical England in order to explore what life abroad in Europe might look like. And so he meets Mr. Norris, who in this book is also a veiled version of a real historical figure. Mr. Norris is a pleasure seeker, he is well connected to people in Berlin, and he hosts these interesting parties where he is also exploring his sexual identity. It's surprisingly risque and, I wouldn't necessarily say graphic, but transgressive in its representations of sex for something from the 1930s. It does explore ideas of kink and of it's not necessarily even morality, it's more in the sense of hedonism. Like, what is the role of sex in someone's life, where they do it not just for enjoyment, but also in a way that says something about their identity. And as this novel continues, it's also starting to explore elements of the political landscape within Germany. You start to realize that this feeling of hedonism and debauchery can't continue, because there are still discussions of social responsibility. There are still discussions between the rapidly rising Nazi Party and the Communist Party, which does seek to provide justice for people in Germany that were still suffering under the various economic shortcomings of that era, the Great Depression also affecting this period of history. It doesn't make these political assertions at the forefront, though. And I guess what it really is trying to say for me is that it's kind of undermining this great men of history narrative. And it's interesting because it's written with awareness of Hitler, but without the awareness of what World War II would become and what Germany would eventually become in the next 20 years to come. And I understand why Christopher Isherwood would then look back on Miss Norris Changes Trains and dislike it. And I wish I read Goodbye to Berlin so I could say more about how all of this comes together. But for what it's worth, I think it's interesting. I think the interplay between hedonism and social responsibility in this novel is well constructed, and the characters are well realized as well. I think it's a very easy read. The dialogue is really well done, and it's just weirdly inviting and also very responsible. I think it doesn't shy away from talking about the negative aspects of the Nazi Party, and there is certainly this fear and unrest and turmoil within Berlin. And so all of that comes together in what I thought was quite a compelling story. And I would give it a 4 out of 5. I think I'm very glad that I read it, and I'm interested in describing this as a book where I think when we look to the past and we look at events like World War II and the Holocaust, we view it as tremendous tragedies caused by named figures who represented this type of evil. Whereas I think reading the works that came immediately before, we're more reminded that everything is made of humans, and societies and parties and political movements are all largely made by humans, not just the ones who are part of that movement, but also the people around them, the people who said things in affirmation, or said things in rejection, or fled, or did something, like whatever they did, all of that's still relevant to what eventually came to be. And so I do feel a bit more enlightened having read this. I mean, I can't speak for how accurate it is, but it does feel very true to what a society would be like before it then lent into this form of fascism. And I think in a time like today, or in any time really, it's still worth holding up, and it's still worth examining, and it's still worth asking these questions of ourselves about our responsibility to our societies and our governments, and how we can balance our desire for pleasure and self-actualization versus what needs to happen in order for justice to exist within the world around us. Like, I think it's well done. I think it's quite a good read. And last one we'll talk about is Because I Didn't Want To, and this is a book that was on the BBC 100 challenge list that I just want to tick off. Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden is a underwhelming book, and I find it interesting to put it into a historical context where international works were seeing a lot of popularity, and it was the growing heights of exoticization of East Asian cultures and really any non-European culture. This feeling of cultures that are so different, so alien to what would be expected from a European or an American audience, that a book like this might seem alluring. I think that's how I would place this, where there are a number of other books that fall into the same category that feel like their whole impetus is to peel back a curtain on another culture in a way that gives a white reader access to that culture, to understand it a little bit more, to know what the differences are, and to then walk away with the feeling that they are a bit more enlightened or inspired about the world, that the world is becoming smaller, and that other cultures that in the past might have been seen as inscrutable are now suddenly understandable. So we follow a young woman first named Chiyo, who then changes their name to Sayuri. She is being raised as a geisha within a household after being sold from a family, and so we follow her rise from someone who is in a very precarious position, wanting to be adopted by the family, and eventually becoming a very successful geisha, and participating in discussions of the various things that geisha are expected to do, often in terms of sexual relationships and partnerships in a very economic sense. It's striking to me how much Sayuri and her identity is commodified, and how she and people who are training her are using elements of her body and of her volition to sell, to auction, to extract money from the wealthy side of Japan. I think my reading of this novel is really marred by the lawsuits and everything that came afterwards. It does feel really, really gross. What's a better word of saying that? It feels really, I guess, exploitative. It very much wants to present this extreme culture in order to, at times, titillate and at times shock a Western audience. And so reading it as someone who, I'm personally not Japanese, and I don't know that much about historical Japanese culture, but reading a book like this makes me think, like, oh, I don't think this should have been allowed, or, like, at the very least, like, it feels a bit disingenuous to have made so much money on exposing and dramatizing this element of society in a way that doesn't feel like it pays a lot of respect to the individuals involved in it is just not a great feeling. And then when I peel that all away, and I think, can I just look at this book for its own merits and critique what it's trying to do in terms of plot and setting and character, I think it really relies on the exoticism. It needs this feeling of fetishization because the actual characters are not that interesting. And the plot that they go through, if you take away that whole sense of this is the way it always is, this is what the rules are, this is a culture that's different to yours, what is it really? Like, it's not that compelling. I would give it a 2 out of 5. I think it's something that makes me a bit unhappy that it did as well as it did, and I'm not surprised that the adapted film also didn't do very well. Like, it's not a romance. There's nothing really romantic about it. It's not an adventure novel. It's not a coming of age novel. It doesn't kind of have all the hallmarks of anything of those genres that would make me really enjoy it. It, at best, is a bit of a recount of a series of events that happen, and it does delve into larger themes of sisterhood and economics and betrayal and agency, but not in a way that's particularly remarkable. And I think, well, there's just so many better works to read than this. So, easy 2 out of 5. Don't read this. Let's all collectively forget it and not talk about it again. You see what I mean? It's like, I'm just not that excited. I'm a bit weary. The books are fine. There's nothing that wrong about it. And I never started making these videos to be someone that was overly critical or was complaining about the quality of books. I hope that I've been able to find something that I appreciate about everything I've talked about this month. But I'm also just kind of waiting for a win. I'm waiting for something that's going to really knock my socks off. And so I'm hopeful that I will find it in the future. But hopefully I can talk about that next month.